the impact of kindness lands in the warmth of the gesture, not the skill of the execution. The person on the receiving end isn't grading your technique. They're experiencing the fact that someone noticed them. Someone chose to stop. We underestimate our impact because we're evaluating the competence of what we're offering. The receiver is experiencing the warmth of being seen. Kindness, it turns out, is one of the few things that grows when you give it away. Welcome to Magic in the Moment, Mindfulness in Real Time. My name is Clayton Platt, and I'll be your host for this podcast journey. And for many people, practicing mindfulness has very little to do with sitting on a cushion, lighting incense, or even focusing on their breath. Just paying attention to what they're doing at any moment. And doing this intentionally can create that same magic. Our time together is intended to share how mindfulness plays out in everyday life for our guests. I've been sitting with something all week. I was recently listening to one of my favorite podcasts, Hidden Brain, and one idea that came out from the research in that podcast, it named something that I've been carrying for 30 years without having a label for it. The episode features psychologist Amit Kumar, and he studies why we hold back from kindness even when we genuinely feel the impulse to give it. And something in what he said sent me straight back to a night on the County Parkway in Westchester County, New York, sometime in the mid-90s. Well, that's where we're going today. A flat tire, a late night, 3 strangers, and $20 that nobody would take. And what all of it taught me about the practice of kindness. Not kindness as a virtue to aspire to, but kindness as something that actually moves through us and between us. It's something that travels. Welcome to Magic in the Moment. I'm Clayton Platt, and let's get back to that night. Okay, it's late. I'm driving home to Stamford, Connecticut from Manhattan. I've had a dinner meeting in the city with important clients. At this point, I was working as an investment management consultant for Smith Barney, and I had dressed the part. Really nice suit, the whole thing. One of those evenings where you really totally feel put together. And then somewhere on the County Parkway, I felt it. Thunk. That unmistakable thud and pull, a flat tire. Now, remember, this is the mid-90s. Cell phones weren't what they are now. Most people, like myself, didn't have them, and I wasn't carrying one. So my options were this: walk miles to the nearest gas station or payphone, or change the tire myself. And I'd done that before, but never in a really nice suit, never this late, never on a highway. So I pulled over, got out, opened the trunk, and started pulling out the gear, the jack, the spare. I was not thrilled about what was going on. And then a car pulled up. It pulled up right behind me on the shoulder, a beat-up sedan, and 3 Latino men got out. And I'll be honest with you, my first thoughts were not positive. It was late, I was alone on a highway, and something in me tensed up. And I'm not going to tell you this, I'm not proud of that. But it's the truth, and it's sort of an important part of the story. So one of them came up to me quickly, his hands up a little, and he was speaking in very broken English, trying to communicate that these guys weren't a threat, that they wanted to help. And that's when something shifted, because I speak pretty fluent Spanish. I mean, I learned it 2 years in Cali, Colombia in my early 20s, and it's stayed with me pretty much. So I switched languages, and suddenly we were having a completely different conversation. So they told me that they'd see me pull over. They saw the situation, a man dressed up, clearly not dressed for what he had to do, alone on the highway at night, and they wanted to stop immediately. But they hesitated. They were afraid that I'd feel threatened by them. So they almost just kept driving. But let that land for a moment. They almost didn't stop, not because they didn't want to help, but because They were worried about how I'd received them, but they did stop. And once we were talking in Spanish, they insisted on changing the tire themselves. Wouldn't hear of me doing it at all, especially given how I was dressed. So I stood there on the shoulder of the County Parkway while these three strangers changed my tire in the dark. When they were done, I pulled out a $20 bill out of my wallet. I wanted to pay them. It felt like the right thing to do. Like, I needed to account for what they'd given me somehow. And they wouldn't take it, wouldn't even consider it. Then they got back in their sedan and drove away. And I watched them go. And they were smiling, a few smiles on their face. These three men who just spent 20 minutes of their evening, it was pretty late at this point, changing a stranger's tire on a dark highway. And these guys who turned down $20 for it, they just drove away smiling. I stood there for a moment before I got back in the car and I thought, I've just received something that I don't have the words for yet. Here's what Amit Kumar's research found and why it sent me back to that night on the Parkway. When people perform acts of kindness, they consistently underestimate how much their kindness will mean to the person receiving it. We focus on the act itself. Did I do it well? Was it the right thing? Will it land awkwardly? Well, the person receiving it experiences something entirely different. They experience being seen. They experience warmth. They experience the simple, profound fact that someone noticed them and chose to stop. So those are two completely different things. And we keep misjudging the gap between them. The three men who stopped for me that night didn't solve a problem that I couldn't have eventually solved myself. I could have changed that tire. It would have taken a while, longer than it took them, and I might well have ruined my suit, but I would have managed. What they actually gave me wasn't the tire change. It was the experience of being seen, of not being alone on a dark highway, of mattering enough for someone to pull over. That's what the research named for me 30 years after the fact. And that's what I'd been carrying without a label. So now I want to offer you three things that night taught me about how kindness actually works. Three things that I keep returning to in my practice and in my life. Number one, those three men almost didn't stop. They saw me, and they felt the impulse to help. And then doubts arose, maybe some fear. Like, what if he thinks we're threatening him? What will he think when he sees us? And they almost kept driving. I certainly would have understood that. And does that sound familiar to you? I mean, that gap between seeing someone in need and actually crossing the threshold to help, that's something most of us know intimately because we've all driven past someone. We've all looked away. We've all told ourselves some version of, I'm not sure this is my place. I probably won't be helpful. Someone else will handle it. It might make matters worse. Here's what I want to say about that. The hesitation is not a character flaw. It is conditioning arising. It's fear, which is one of the most natural things a human can feel. The hesitation doesn't make you unkind. The hesitation makes you human. But mindfulness, this is where the practice matters. Mindfulness gives us the ability to see the hesitation without being controlled by it. When we can notice the story we're telling ourselves in that gap, it'll be awkward. I don't have the right skills. They probably don't want my help. We create just enough space to make a choice, not to eliminate the fear, but to act in the presence of it. So that pause between impulse and action isn't weakness. The pause is the practice. That's where the awareness lives. And awareness, as I come back to again and again in this work, is where everything begins. So the first teaching that I want to share is this. When you notice the hesitation, don't judge it and don't rush past it. Get curious about what's happening in there. What story is playing? What are you afraid of? And just seeing it clearly is often enough to let you move through it. Okay, teaching part 2. So after that night on the Parkway, something changed in me. I stopped waiting until I felt competent enough to help in other situations. Because here's what I had told myself for years without quite knowing I was telling myself this. I'll help when I have something real to offer. I'll stop when I know I can actually fix the problem. And I'll reach out when I have the right words. And what I learned that night, what those 3 men demonstrated without saying a word about it, is that the impact of kindness lands in the warmth of the gesture, not the skill of the execution. The person on the receiving end isn't grading your technique. They're experiencing the fact that someone noticed them. Someone chose to stop. So this is what Kumar's research keeps finding across study after study. We underestimate our impact because we're evaluating the competence of what we're offering. The receiver is experiencing the warmth of being seen. So we're measuring 2 completely different things. And we keep talking ourselves out of acting because we don't trust our own competence. The framework I use in this work is simple. Awareness plus choice equals results. The awareness is seeing the need, really seeing it, not scrolling past it. The choice is crossing the threshold despite your reluctance, not having the perfect solution, not waiting until you feel ready, just making the offer. And the result isn't necessarily a perfectly changed tire. The result is the human being who felt seen. You don't have to fix it. You just have to show up. The sincere offer of help, even when you can't complete the task, even when you don't have the full answer, even when you fumble the words, the sincere offer of help makes the person in need feel supported. It tells them, you're not invisible. You're not alone. You matter enough for me to stop. That's the gift. And it costs so much less than we think. Teach you point 3. I watched 3 men drive away smiling after changing a stranger's tire on a dark highway and turning down $20. And I've thought about that image many times in the 30 years since. Because what it showed me and what the research confirms is that kindness doesn't flow in one direction. It isn't a transaction where one person gives and one person receives and then it's done. It completes a circuit. Both people are changed by it. The men who stopped for me didn't just give something. They also received something that money in that moment literally could not buy. They got to experience themselves as people who show up, who cross the threshold, who see someone in need and they act on it. And that kind of experience does something to a person. It reinforces something true about who they are. On my side of the circuit, I drove home that night a different person. Not just grateful, though I was deeply grateful. Different. The next time I saw someone who might need help, something new and different arose in me. Not the familiar calculation, can I fix this? Do I have the right skills? Will it be awkward? Something closer to readiness, a kind of yes that was already forming before I'd finished assessing the situation. And that's the ripple. And the ripple isn't a metaphor. It's something that actually happens when kindness moves through us. We become more available to it. We become more willing to be the person who stops. Kumar puts it this way. If people realized how much their kindness actually means to the people receiving it, it might create a virtuous cycle of giving. And I think he's right. But I'd add something from the contemplative side. The cycle starts not with the realization, but with the act. You don't have to fully understand it before you do it. You just have to do it once and feel what happens to the other person and to yourself. Kindness, it turns out, is one of the few things that grows when you give it away. This week, I'm inviting you to notice the hesitation, not to fix it, not to push through it with force, just to notice it. When the impulse to offer kindness arises and something instinctively inside you is holding back, take one breath in that space. Get curious. What's the story? What are you afraid will happen? And then ask yourself, what would it actually cost me to make the offer? Not to solve the problem, not to have the perfect words, just to stop and to say, in whatever way feels natural, I see you. Can I help? You don't need to be competent. You don't need to be certain. You don't need fluent Spanish. And you don't need a jack and a spare tire in the trunk. You just need to be willing to cross the threshold. The rest take care of itself more often than we know. Where does kindness go when it travels? Well, it goes further than we think. It goes into the person who received it, not just as a nice moment, but as something that changes them in ways that they may not be able to articulate for years. And then it just keeps moving into the next person they encounter and the one after that, and in ways that nobody tracks and nobody sees. 3 men drove away smiling 30 years ago on a dark highway in Westchester County, New York. They had no idea what they were setting in motion. And neither did I, standing there on the shoulder watching their taillights disappear. But here we are, talking about it today. Still feeling it, still passing it forward. That's how kindness travels. Thank you for being here. If this episode moved something in you, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need it. That's how this work travels too. So you can find me at mindfulnessrealtime.com. The Friday morning Sangha on Zoom is always open if you want a place to practice together, and you can find out information about that on my website. But until next time, take good care of yourselves and of each other. Hey, thanks for listening. I want to give a big shout out to John Gehring of Story Trust Media for his expert editing and wonderful production guidance. I also am deeply grateful for the ongoing support I receive from Meditation for Leadership and their sponsorship. So that's all for now. Until next time, this is Clayton Platt saying, watch for those moments of magic when mindfulness shows up in real time in your life.